Hello viewers, and welcome to my latest interview video where I have the pleasure of speaking to Hemant Mehta, who is the editor of the friendlyatheist.com. He's actually also the author of I Sold My Soul on eBay, Viewing Faith Through an Atheist's Eyes, The Young Atheist Survival Guide, Helping Secular Students Thrive, and Hemant was also good enough to provide the foreword to my book, The Reluctant Apostate. Hemant, thanks so much for joining me.
Lloyd, nice to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. So let's get started, shall we, with some of these questions. I've got a nice long list of questions to go through.
All right.
I think the first thing I wanted to talk about, if you don't mind, was Jehovah's Witnesses. Obviously, that's the nature of my channel. You've been very kind in writing extensively about Jehovah's Witnesses on your blog over the last couple of years. You were also obviously kind enough to provide the foreword to my book. What is it about Jehovah's Witnesses that you find so compelling?
What surprises me, I think, is that even as I became an atheist around the age of 14, I became more of an active atheist and actually, working with organizations, writing about it, obviously. That was like high school, college. That was after college that I got involved in these groups, started writing the website. And I'm 34, I think. Yeah, sure. I'm 34 now. So it's been a while. I've been an atheist for a long enough time. I've been an active atheist for a long enough time. You would think atheists know who the dangers are when it comes to religion. We know the damage that, conservative Christianity can do to our government, things like that. These are not complicated issues for, I think, a lot of atheists. For me personally, I know a lot of people of a lot of different religions, and none of this is surprising. I kind of know what people believe in a roundabout sort of way, at least. So I grew up, I knew some Jehovah's Witnesses, and it was never a big deal. So what surprises me is that only in the past several years, in part thanks to you and some other people, I've really come to understand, like, oh, whoa, this religion that I thought was, it had a few quirks. It had a few, the blood transfusion thing. That's a little weird, but okay. I mean, it's not, as far as government goes, that's not a huge thing. It affects them. It doesn't affect me so much. But then you realize, oh man, there's abuse going on. The way they treat people within their community who want to leave the community, that's like downright ridiculous. The extent that they go. And what bothers me personally is that I didn't know any of that stuff. I didn't know the extent of how deep this whole religion went and how much damage it did to a lot of people in it and people who have left it. And so that was surprising to me. Like, as someone who talks about religion all the time, I was thinking I should have known this, but I didn't know any of this. So that's, I think, why Jehovah's Witnesses especially surprised me. I know we're not talking about a huge percentage of the country or something, but for the people who are in it, and I think a lot of us know people who are in it, we know people come to our door about it. These are things that never seem to come up in kind of if you know only a couple things about Jehovah's Witnesses, this is the stuff this stuff never, disfellowshipping doesn't come up in that conversation. So that's why I think I've paid closer attention to it, especially when it's in the news talking about the abuse scandals, when I hear personal stories about people being shunned, when I see your take on, like, this is what they're showing at the conferences. And, like, this is what all Jehovah's Witnesses pretty much are seeing right now. That is surprising to me because I just wasn't aware of that whole subculture.
Well, thank you for drawing attention to it. I mean, first of all, thank you for being sensitive to what's going on, not just anyone can, I suppose, talk about Islam to some extent or talk about, let's say, Scientology or, religions that are just notorious for being, outrageous or harmful or destructive. But
by the way, let me add one thing to this. If you talk about, if I asked a random atheist, can you tell me what the problems with Islam are? And it's not that everything about Islam or all Muslims are bad. No. But if I say, can you point to any damage that might be caused by, radical Islam? Of course, everyone has an answer to that. Scientology, same thing. We know the sort of mind control stuff they have going on. Like I just said, I didn't know that was the case for Jehovah's Witnesses. But the funny thing is, I grew up in the Jain religion, an Indian one that most people don't know anything about. And the funny thing is, when I've even heard atheists talk about it, including a guy like Sam Harris, who is, an ardent critic of religion, he is like, religion, even moderate religion can be bad because it provides cover for other religions. But if everyone was like extremist Jain, maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing. Yeah. And I remember hearing him say that, and I've heard other atheists say that. And I'm like, no, it's really bad. I know Jains preach nonviolence, but like they also fast. And it's not like a one-day fast. Sometimes they go several days. People have died of starvation because of the way they fast. It's unhealthy for you. So like it's that sort of thing where growing up in that culture, I was aware of our flaws, but I don't think anyone who had even a casual understanding of my religion, they didn't know any of that. So I think that's why I felt a kinship, I think, to some of the Jehovah's Witness stuff.
Well, you've surprised me there, because obviously I've not been doing my research properly, but I didn't have you down as a former Jain, frankly. Yeah. And now that I know that, we'll obviously have to schedule a proper video where we compare the two religions.
Oh, I know, right?
I'm familiar with what you were saying about Sam Harris, because I got the point that he was making, which is that Jains are about non-violence. So,
yeah, and we're vegetarian. All of this sounds philosophically sound, and you're supposed to be a good person, but the extent of how you're supposed to be a good person can be taken to extremes. Isn't that the story with all religion? And it's like, no, I'm not immune from that. We're not better than other religions because of that. And I remember like early on when I was an atheist, I almost wanted to shout that to people, like, you don't understand. My religion is also a problem in certain ways. I think one of the old articles I wrote on the website that got an outsized amount of attention at the time, even though I wasn't I wasn't getting that much attention on the website, was about the problems with Jainism. And it was one of these articles that kept getting comments like month after month, long after anyone should have been reading it.
Angry Jains remonstrating with you.
Yes. And the thing is, none of them ever addressed anything I said. They were just like, but it's good. It's like, no, you got to speak out against this. Come on.
Absolutely. Well, I'm fascinated. I will definitely need to get you back on the channel to talk about that, because I'm trying to kind of check off all of the religions in comparing them with JWs. But what fascinates me is, you've talked about the kind of the public perception of Jehovah's Witnesses and the way that, you were among those who just didn't understand that there was a problem. And what's fascinating is that when you are a Jehovah's Witness, you're taught to think that the world is actively seeking to create a bad name for Jehovah's Witnesses. It's actually trying to find problems where none exist. And only when you get out of Jehovah's Witnesses do you realize that actually the reverse is true. And actually people don't care about Jehovah's Witnesses and are hardly talking about them at all unless something huge and major happens.
Right. So either we're not talking about them, or it's like, oh, they seem nice. I would invite them in if I had time. That's pretty much it. That's all I heard.
Yeah.
I speak for everybody, but it wasn't bad.
Sure.
And honestly, the blood thing, that honestly only came up in like ethical discussions of, if you were a doctor, how would you treat these people? And we would discuss, do you honor their beliefs, or do you, impose your own values upon? But like, it didn't come up as a bad thing. It came up as this is their belief. We must respect it. That's sort of a conversation. But you're right. Like, I didn't hear any, smack talk about Jehovah's Witnesses growing up.
And with blood transfusions, I guess you don't want to think that it could be killing people, do you? Or tens of thousands of people, which is what we're now beginning to estimate the death.
Yeah, I never heard that statistic, that's for sure. Yeah. But more than anything else, it didn't strike me as a harmful thing. It was just a religious quirk. And every Catholics believe the consecrated wafer is literally Jesus. I find that weird. But again, that's their religion. That's what they believe. You know, you're taught to respect that stuff and not think too hard about it. And so all of these beliefs didn't really, unless you actually look at them and think about them, I think for a lot of people, at least my experience, it's in one ear, out the other. You don't think about it too much. And it takes someone to point it out and say, no, this is a problem. This isn't a harmless belief. This actually does damage. And sharing some of these stories of, I think there was a girl a while back who talked to her classroom about growing up as a Jehovah's Witness. And she was saying, this is one of the issues for me. That was a breaking point. And hearing a story like that, I never heard it before growing up. And I think that makes a difference when people hear it coming from someone saying, no, this hurt me. Here's why it hurt me. Here's what's going to happen to me now that I'm talking to you about this. And when you hear it coming from, I'll say the same thing about like the Mormon faith. Right now, I think last week, BYU in Utah, they just approved like caffeinated Coke in their dining hall. And like every headline across the board was, isn't this adorable? Now, it's not like it was banned in the religion. That's that people have misinformation on that. But now they have it in their dining hall, and isn't that cute? Look at how excited these Mormons are. And it's like, there's a bigger problem here that for some religious reason, they thought caffeine was banned. It wasn't. I mean, that's usually a non-Mormon stereotype, but like they can't drink coffee. They don't drink tea. And like, isn't that a problem when you're learning to think that way? And shouldn't we raise people's awareness that there is something wrong with your religion when you say, you know, certain drinks are forbidden because of this reason or that reason? If you don't go to your training session, I think there was another story about that I posted recently. This is one that was, I think for a lot of readers, it resonated. A guy he told his parents he didn't want to go on his Mormon mission trip. And they always have a training camp before you go on the trip. And right before he left for camp, his family went on vacation. It's the last time they would spend time together for a couple of years.
Oh, yeah, I read about that, yeah.
And he announced he didn't want to do it. And they basically left him there. They abandoned him there. He had to find his way back home. It was horrible. And the Mormon publication that wrote about this, because the kid is now in training camp, and he talks about it like, I was wrong to say I didn't want to go, and look, I'm a better Mormon now. They wrote this story as if it was uplifting. And it's like, no, this is seriously, this is a problem when you have anyone, a family that does this, a kid who was abandoned because of this, the fact that he's now in camp talking about how great it was. I mean, getting those stories out there, I think, makes a difference.
Oh, definitely. And frankly, I mean, I don't troll the internet too much for atheist news, but I struggle to see how stories like that and some of the stories you've covered about Jehovah's Witnesses would get broader attention if it wasn't for the fact that you were covering them. I really don't. And another thing I've noticed is that when you share a video, in most cases, the views absolutely balloon. Like the video of the girl speaking in front of the classroom, for example, that you mentioned, the views shot up when you shared that video. I know Cosmic Skeptic, Alex O'Connor's got a few things to say about the effect you had on his channel, how the views just skyrocketed. Is that phenomenon kind of surprising to you? Is it nice to see that kind of response when you share something?
It is nice to see. I mean, it's nice to know that, oh, people are actually reading something that I wrote. So that's nice. I've also been doing it for like 10, 15 years. So if they're not, I'm in the wrong line of work. But it's cool. I mean, the one thing that I might have some control over is to direct people's attention and say, look, you probably haven't heard of this story. Come check this out. Look at this video. I mean, one cool thing. Last night, someone sent me a video of like, we've heard stories by now of Orthodox Jewish men who refuse to sit next to women on airplanes because incidentally touching them they think it's like sexual, it's wrong. It's like, that's a little extreme there. But they're like going on these planes saying women have to move. And that's become a big story. But the thing is, someone sends me a link yesterday saying on a flight, someone got video of an Orthodox Jewish man going to like the movie screen at the front of the plane and covering it up with a blanket. And the thing is, that I looked for coverage of that. I didn't see virtually any coverage of that. And that's one of these stories where it's like, look at how absurd this is. We're not talking like harm, physical harm, but like, not only do they refuse to see this movie, they refuse to let anybody see this movie on the plane. If I can direct people to say, I know I talk about how religion is bad all the time, but you defend this. You can't. It's crazy.
Is this a case? I mean, how this looks to me is that the media is simply terrified of looking bigoted, or in this case, anti-Semitic.
Yes, I think that's a part of it. I think in some cases, too, in their defense, they might say, that was one dude doing something on his own. It's probably not a newsworthy story. Like the New York Times isn't going to cover that unless it's happening all over the place. So I can understand why certain places don't cover it. A lot of places don't have religion reporters and things like that. But again, my self-described job is I want to direct people's attention to the problems with religion and show them why this is a problem. And it affects a lot of different areas in life. And that is a clear-cut example of religious thinking gone, I think, too far. And then you have the more serious cases of like, oh, Alabama's on the verge of electing a guy who basically wants to institute the Bible as our new constitution, more or less. That is a serious problem, but that's getting a lot of coverage. I could post all I want about that. No one's going to care what I have to say necessarily. But posting about, this girl who's giving a speech in her classroom that no one's paying any attention to, that might actually resonate with a lot of people because they're not seeing it anywhere else. And it's an interesting story that they ought to hear. So honestly, if you're interested in anyone who's watching those stories, like the girl saying the speech or these Orthodox Jewish men on the plane, in terms of like just straight up hits, they get more hits than like talking about Donald Trump for me. Yeah. Because everyone's talking about Donald Trump, but no one's talking about these other things. So if I can direct your attention to Alex O'Connor because he made a really good video, I know not a lot of people are necessarily covering that. And so I can show you something you're not seeing anywhere. So that's nice. And it's cool to know that, oh, if I tell people to look somewhere, maybe they will. So, hey, if I can give those videos a bump, awesome.
No, it's a really, really useful service, and I can't thank you enough for providing it. Speaking of, your activism work, you already mentioned that you kind of got involved from your teens. What's surprising to me, I mean, you mentioned that you were raised in a Jain family.
Yeah.
Lots of people, I say lots of people, speaking for myself, there's kind of like a flame within me due to injustice that I've experienced. And I know that's the case with other activists or atheist activists as well. It just astonishes me the extent to which you're doing this work without necessarily having the horror story that you hear other people come out with. What's the motivation for you, do you think?
I think when it comes to religion, it's probably the first big realization I came to on my own. No one told me, hey, God may not exist. No one told me religion was bad. It's something I kind of figured out on my own, and then I researched it. And it's probably one of the few things where I'm like, I feel so strongly that I'm right about this, that I'm right about God not existing, that I'm right about religion being a harmful thing overall. And I feel like I'm alone. I know there are other atheists out there, but like you feel like you're in the minority on that one. I'm sure you feel the same with Jehovah's Witnesses, where it's like, no, this is a harmful religion. But when you're growing up in that community, I'm sure it's like, I'm the minority viewpoint here, but you want to tell people about it. So to me, I feel very strongly that if I can save people the time of going through that realization period and just point it out, then I'm providing some sort of service to people. So that's kind of nice. But, I'm also vegetarian for what it's worth. But so are a bunch of other people. And I don't feel, it's weird, I don't feel nearly as strongly about trying to convince people to be vegetarian, even though it's for ethical reasons. I do feel strongly in that sense. But like that passion just never got lit up for me. But the atheism one has always been pretty strong. I mean, it's the one of the very few things where I feel like I'm in the minority and I feel like I'm totally right about it. I can't say that about politics because a lot of people share my views on that. I can't say that about a lot of things, but on this one, not only do I feel right about it, I feel like I also kind of know the landscape. I know people who are running organizations. I know who the authors are. I know who the influencers are in that community. And I think I can also know when something's a story and when it's not a story. So if I can direct your attention to something, I hope it's worth your time and not just, random stuff.
Actually, that brings me to another question, which I haven't written down, but I'm glad you've reminded me. And I wanted to talk, I want to talk about your approach to stories, because one thing that really impressed me early on, I can't think of it now, but you did a lecture on your approach to stories and why it's important to fact check and make sure that stories are accurate, even if it means doing some legwork. And I know that resonated very strongly with me at the time, because I'm not as hands-on with JW Survey as I was back then, but it's so easy when you're writing on this subject, especially when you're dealing with cults and there's emotions involved, to just leap to an explanation that isn't necessarily supported by facts, but that just sounds right to you. How would you describe the importance of, as I say, being accurate and making sure that the story is on the level?
This is where it comes to the last thing you should do is believe something just because I said it or because Richard Dawkins said it or whatever. I mean, isn't that the sort of critical thinking we say is bad in religion? Just because your pastor told you an anecdote, like get some citations for that, But I'll give you an example of this. Last month, when the hurricane hit Texas, a lot of people very quickly, I might add, were blaming Joel Osteen, who runs a mega church there. That seats like 40,000 people. And they're like, this is one of the largest churches in the country. Why isn't this millionaire pastor opening his doors for people? That seems like an obvious way to help out. So what's up with that? And the thing is, I hadn't heard him comment on it, the pastor, Joel Osteen. I hadn't read any news stories, but I heard the vitriol. And he's such a easy whipping boy for everybody.
Yeah, you just want to do unpleasant things to him when you see him.
It's so easy to mock him. And so it's like I saw all these people like just rushing on him saying, look at what happens. He makes all the money. He won't even help the poor people who have nowhere to go. So much for, this smiling pastor who's not helping people. So the very least I could do is, before I pile on, is there anything that suggests, because if I'm trying to play devil's advocate here, was there some reason their church was closed? That seems like an obvious question to ask after a hurricane. It doesn't strike, I don't know Joel Osteen at all, but it's like, that doesn't strike me as the sort of thing you would do to say, let me close my doors to people who need help. If anything, for a guy who loves publicity as he does,
it's a great opportunity.
It's smart to open it up. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Think about what the news would be if he did that. So it's like, none of this seems to make sense. And what I found is that, they had opened their doors for people in the middle of a natural disaster years ago. They did that. It was like 5,000 people, not several more thousand, but they did it. They had raised money in a secular way for other causes. So it's like, what people are saying about it now doesn't seem to make sense. I get why they're all piling on, but it doesn't make sense. And he didn't. So anyway, I wrote about that, saying, look, I know why people are piling on, but nothing I am finding says they were allowed to bring people in. Some of the things I saw on social media from members of the church were saying things like the roads, people couldn't get on the roads. The garage, their underground garage, may have been flooded, and Joel Osteen said later, had we let people in and something happened to them, maybe the church flooded and there was a disaster, think of what that story would have been. Now, he did say later excuses that I didn't really think were that valid, but that was days later. So here's the point I'm trying to make. if you can verify a story and I can point to you and say, this is where I'm getting the information from, so don't blame me if I'm wrong. I'm trying to tell you where my thinking is coming from. That helps. Everyone should look for that. I can't tell you how many tips I get from people saying, here's some African newspaper with maybe no credibility. I've never heard of it before. And they're saying like, oh, a pastor tried to do a baptism and then the person drowned. Or like he was trying to walk on water and then he drowned and a crocodile ate him or something. It's like, that's really far-fetched. What's the source for this? And isn't that what, as an atheist, as someone who's trying to promote critical thinking, shouldn't we be asking those questions? And so it seems like I send a lot of messages back saying, I'm only seeing the story in this one publication. It doesn't say it's satire or anything like that, but it's not like they provide links. There are no pictures of this. If I post anything, it'll be to say, don't spread this until you see anything else, because there's no story here. No one's corroborating it. And to me, that's a bigger deal than the atheism. The atheism is a byproduct of trying to get people to think critically and ask good questions. And if I'm not doing that because I'm falling for the same hoax as everyone else, then I'm making a mistake. And I'm not saying I'm perfect at it, because I've fallen for the hoaxes.
Yeah, I have as well. Yeah.
At the very least, then I can try to go back and correct it and say, look, I did this. I was wrong. Sorry, I wasn't doing it on purpose. But that's something I can at least try to do.
Yeah, I think it's just a case of when you do get caught. I mean, I've been caught out before. I've gone down a crazy wild goose chase with a story that's ended up making me look very silly. And the only thing you can do is just apologize for it and say, this is not what happened. And I think that actually earns you more credibility at the end of it, if you're willing to hold your hands up and say, yeah.
Totally. And so I've tried to talk about that when I think the talk you saw me give, that's the thing I was pressing, which is to say, if you can get the facts on this, I mean, look, I will fully admit, I am not a reporter. Reporters do an amazing job, especially when they're really good at it. I'm not that. Sometimes I'll make phone calls. If I need to, if I can, I will do that. But a lot of times I'm relying on the work of other people. And so the one thing I can offer is to say, I'm trying to get this right. I'm trying to be credible. If I'm saying something weird, I'm going to try to justify it for you. And if I'm linking to a publication, it's only because I think you could trust it. And if you can't, I'll at least let you know that. You know, take this story with a grain of salt because it's coming from this weird website, but it's kind of funny. So you should check it out. But like, maybe it's not true. You should know that. So but you're right. I think it lends more credibility to everything you do. And that's the one thing I hope I have.
Indeed. Now, obviously, you go by the moniker The Friendly Atheist, but I know many who don't accept the title or the label atheist, despite the fact that they admit to not being believers. So what do you say to people who argue, oh, well, we don't need labels?
I don't argue with them. I don't care what you call yourself.
Sure.
To me, the bigger issue is, what are you doing with whatever your beliefs are? If you don't believe in God, sure, I'm sure in the back of my head, I'm like, you're an atheist. Neil deGrasse Tyson, you're an atheist, whatever. But it doesn't matter because I see what
you don't lose sleep over it, basically.
I don't know. I don't lose sleep over it. The bigger question is, what are you going to do with it? Look, I spend a lot of time talking about demographics and like what percentage of the United States are non-religious or not affiliated with organized religion. I think if I have the numbers right, it's like close between like 30 and 40%, depending on the study you look at any given day, are people with no organized religious affiliation. But only like 3% of people are atheists by that word. Who are all the rest of these people? They believe in something. Meh. Like, I can make fun of that all day long, but it's like, but those aren't the people who are like causing me to lose sleep or freak out every time I, look at Twitter in the morning. I'm not worried about those people because they're doing good things in the name of whatever the hell they believe in. So there's a difference to me between people who use their beliefs to do actual harm, which I'm seeing in the government, which I see a lot of evangelical Christians doing. They're promoting bad policies and it's hurting a lot of people. But there are a lot of Christians who do good things, so that's nice. There are a lot of people who are religious, but they're not trying to proselytize. They're not hurting people. with their beliefs. And this is kind of what I was thinking about the Jehovah's Witnesses. They're not hurting anybody. They're wrong, but they're not hurting anybody. So I don't care. That's a secondary priority. To me, I've always tried to focus on the first one. If you believe in something wrong and you're doing harm with it, let's try to point out the harm, because I think that'll do more to get people to say, okay, religion is bad. But I've gotten this too, like, how come you don't really talk about philosophy? Why don't you go after people who believe in wrong things? Because isn't that a problem too? And it is. I'm not like, yeah, sure, I wish everyone would think exactly like I do on everything. But those aren't the people trying to hurt anybody else. So to me, that's a lower priority in terms of what I care to spend my time talking about. So look, if you have a different label, if someone has they don't like the word atheist, fine. Call yourself whatever you want. What are you doing with it? At the end of the day, I don't really care much about the labels. And I've said many times, I don't even know that I would, if I started the website today, I would not call it Friendly Atheist.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Because I don't think I'm that friendly.
You're very friendly, Hemant. You're one of the friendliest people I know.
Lies. I thought, I realized only later that I didn't mean it to describe me. I was describing it like, I know a bunch of atheists. They're all really nice people. They're not angry. They're not militant. The word wasn't meant to describe me. And I realized later, like, oh, that's not what anyone thinks. I'm acting holier than thou. And I'm throwing everyone else under the bus. That wasn't the case at all.
You didn't intend it as a moniker, but that's how people think of it, basically.
It was honestly a 2-second decision that stuck with me for a way too long. And now it's like, I don't want to change it now. It's too late. But yeah, so.
Fantastic. Well, I want to, I'm trying to get a feel for the atheist community. I feel as though with my work, I think of it as like a battlefield, and I think of my work as being this remote corner of the battlefield that hardly anyone pays any attention to. But I'm kind of curious as to what's going on, where the action's happening. Not that there's no action happening where I am. But yeah. What do you think's changed over the years that you've been involved in the atheist community? What, if anything, has changed?
I probably got involved around 2003 or 4. So just to give you a sense of timing here, God Delusion, Richard Dawkins' book, hadn't even come out for another couple of years. So just to give you an idea, when I started getting really active, a lot of the conversations I was having with groups I was working with or seeing in the media was primarily, look at these atheists who are saying things we're not used to hearing. Like, there are groups forming on college campuses for atheists. These new atheist books are trying to convince people not to believe in God. That was it for several years. That was what all the energy was put into and paying attention to. There were other things happening, but they didn't always get the press. Here's what's neat. Now we're experiencing all the pain of growing as a movement, because every time you see a study about how many atheists are there, it's always higher than whatever the last numbers were. But with that comes the realization that, we're not, once we get over the fact that we don't believe in God, that to me is not controversial anymore. Everyone knows someone who doesn't believe in God, and I think a lot of young people don't care. All right, I mean, they're just, you don't believe in God? Whatever. That's not as big of a deal in a lot of places. But now it's an interesting question of what should we care about? Because our identity was always about we don't believe, and that separates us from everybody else. So what do you do when being an atheist just isn't a big deal anymore? And what's interesting is it's not clear cut. You have a bunch of people talking about very different things. So, I have friends who are people of color who are saying, if you're a black atheist, you face a whole host of different issues than if you are Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins. And we should talk about that because no one's paying attention to that story. So they focus on it. That is amazing. There are atheists who focus on charity work because religious people know how to do charity. We don't. We don't have the infrastructure for it. And it's not that we're not nice people or we're not charitable, but we don't have the infrastructure. So they're trying to provide that. There are people who talk about how to raise your kids as atheists. Here's an interesting one. There are atheists who don't support abortion rights. And the thing is, usually when we think about who's pro-life, we think about, really religious people who think God made you human from the moment of conception. Well, these people have secular reasons for why they believe we ought to preserve life from the moment, sperm meets egg. And it's like, I can kind of see where they're coming from, even if I don't agree with it. But the question is, what do you do with those people, in the sense that do they speak when atheists gather? Do you ask them to give talks about their beliefs? Do you even invite them? Because I think there's been some controversy at times where the pro-life atheist groups have asked to reserve a table at a conference, and they've been rejected. What if you're a Republican atheist who believes in, fiscal conservatism, something like that? Even if you don't, even though the Republican Party is like very against separation of church and state, what do you do with the Republican atheists? Like, you are starting to have these divisions that, to me, don't make any sense. But those people exist, and they are not just one person on the fringe. And so, to me, what's going on in the atheist world right now is it is growing. You're seeing a lot of infighting, which happens with every subculture. I realize this, but infighting about various things, about who is acceptable to speak about certain things. I think this weekend, there are atheists who, they go on YouTube and they trash feminism. Should they be invited to speak at a conference? That's an issue. These things are starting to happen. Whereas 10 years ago, all the talks you would see all the time were about God. Here's why you shouldn't believe in God. Here's a response to all the apologetics people offer for why God exists. Here's how you should respond to that. I don't hear those talks anymore, because I think there's just an understanding that we've all heard that. Yeah. Those resources are out there. Let's talk about other issues. And there's no consensus on what issues we should talk about. And if I may, let me get in a cheap plug here while I'm here.
By all means.
A project I've been working on for a while now with a friend of mine, Camille, is the argument that the atheist community, however you want to define that, it's not well defined, should be supportive of the LGBTQ rights community and all the allies and that whole area. But I've heard a lot of people say, how dare you tell me what I should support when it comes to those rights? Because atheism means I don't believe in God, and then we're done. Like, that's the end of the conversation. And so the entire book that Camille wrote is trying to make the argument for why LGBT issues are atheist issues, and we should care about it. Like, there is no secular argument against equality. They're the same sort of forces that keep us down as atheists are being used against LGBTQ people. So that's kind of the argument here. But what's funny to me is there is some pushback from some people who are like, how dare you tell me how I ought to think about LGBTQ rights issues? Yeah. And to me, it's a no-brainer, but it's not the case for everyone. So there's your cheap plug. The book is called Queer Disbelief, if you're interested. But that's the sort of, it's interesting now seeing all these different groups that are relatively tiny, all kind of focus on their specific issue. And all of them are now starting to conflict with other groups. And who knows what's going to happen? I know what happens with every movement all the time, but that's what's going on with my neck of the woods right now.
Well, first of all, it's not a cheap plug, because I was going to ask you about it. So The Queer Disbelief is the title of the book. I obviously know you're involved in it. Am I right in saying this? It's Camille that's writing it?
Camille wrote the whole book. We kind of chatted early on about what the structure would look like. Camille wrote for my site for several years about LGBTQ issues. And then I raised this question to her. We worked out an outline together of what issues we ought to cover. She did the actual work of researching and writing this up. And I helped edit it, look through it, make sure it makes sense to me and how I want it to look. But she did the work. I mean, it's her name on the book. It's her book. Brilliant. So, but yeah, it's a new project for us because I've never done anything like that before. So we're Kickstartering it right now. So hopefully it'll come through. But yeah, it was an interesting project, though, because it's so easy for me as an atheist to say religion is, so bad for LGBTQ people. And Camille spoke with people who are like trans Muslims. They are evangelical and gay. And it's like they found a way to reconcile it. And we asked them, like, isn't this contradictory? Don't you feel like a hypocrite in this sense? The answer was no. And so hearing some of those voices that Camille found, hearing her talk about why religion could be a good force in some of these ways, it's fascinating. That's not something I've heard before, and it's important to acknowledge that that view is out there.
Indeed. Well, I find it a fascinating subject, and I'm going to put a link in the description to the Kickstarter campaign so that people can check it out and hopefully support it. What's interesting, well, there's a few things I want to unpack there. I want to kind of come back to what you said about the atheist movement kind of evolving.
Yeah.
But you talk about the LGBTQ issue. What's interesting for me is that when I first started my activism, I obviously didn't like the idea of gays and lesbians being frowned on or denounced by Jehovah's Witnesses. But I felt a reticence to kind of go on the warpath with the issue because I knew that the Bible speaks against homosexuals, and I didn't want people to easily point the finger and say, you see, he doesn't even know this, it's in the Bible. I didn't want to make things more complicated than they needed to be. But that changed the more gay ex-JWs I met, and the more I saw what an impact it has when you grow up in a community where not only do you have doubts about the religion, but your very nature is being questioned. And what that does psychologically to people, I can only imagine.
And to go up to people who talk about, love the sinner, hate the sin, and say, okay, well, your love caused this person to, do self-harm. It drove some people to suicide. It is, look at these couples who can't adopt a child. They can't be together as a family. They can't visit their loved one in a hospital because of your Christian love. Good. Force them to deal with that because they're causing that harm. And so they should hear those stories. And so at that point, it's like, I don't care what the Bible says. Even if you're right, the Bible says that. Here is what you are doing. So you better feel good about that or stop it. And I think it's hard for a lot of Christians to make sense of, like, how do I say I'm being true to the Bible according to my interpretation of it, and yet I have to face these people? Like, I can't just sit in my bubble and avoid them, because this is one thing the LGBT movement did really well, which is by coming out, they made it so that you can't not know them. Like, ask a high schooler anywhere, do you know someone who's LGBTQ? The answer is inevitably yes. They know someone personally who is probably affected by this stuff. So they can't just hide and, claim that they have nothing to do with what they do. Like, I don't know. So to me, get in their face about those stories, and it doesn't matter what the Bible says. Maybe the Bible does say, if you want to interpret it that way and say the Bible says this is immoral, you can't have a same-sex relationship.
Leviticus 20 verse 13 wants gay people killed, so it's pretty unequivocal.
Yeah, and Roy Moore, who just won the Republican primary in Alabama for the U.S. Senate, says homosexual acts ought to be illegal. The Pope says, the Catholic Church says it's gravely immoral. So, I mean, those things are in there. And when you're pushing them into public policy, it ruins people's lives. So I wish more pastors would acknowledge that, okay, this is what we believe as a church, as a religion. You know what you won't see in those same churches? Here's a montage of all the families who can't be together, whose lives you've ruined because you're stuck on whatever this interpretation of the book is. I think if more people had to deal with it, maybe they wouldn't be so strong about that. And what's really interesting is a lot of young evangelicals, a lot of younger everything religious. I think that we're starting to see that change too, because they can't reconcile the two, and they'd rather be on the side of being a decent person than saying, okay, this interpretation is the only way out. Indeed.
Now, I want to just go back to what you were saying earlier about the way the atheist movement's evolved, because if I understand you correctly, you were saying that when you first got involved in the movement, things were fairly binary, and it was a case of, are you religious or are you not religious? And that was basically the only argument.
People who are not religious, let's provide them with a community of sorts so they can meet each other, find each other. And pretty much it.
Precisely, but what you've described is growing pains, essentially, because there's so many people becoming atheists, and inevitably you're going to have different ideas, including on the issue of LGBTQ.
Finding atheists is no longer an issue. We can find atheists. There are communities it's not hard to find them. So now it's, all right, now you're an atheist. What do you do with that?
I guess,
where does that get you?
I guess what that tells me is that atheism is an intellectual position about whether or not God exists, or whether or not a person believes in God, more accurately. It doesn't say anything about what a person's politics are, or even whether they're a humanist.
Right.
Humanism is, I think, been described by Dawkins as atheism plus. But it's humanism is something separate entirely, in my view.
Right. Humanism has its own set of values that they promote, and they're good values. It's all well and good, but it's the same thing when you identify in a certain way. What happens when that's no longer special? I mean, I think for a lot of gay people, there will come a time when saying I'm gay just isn't a big deal. We're not there yet, but it's like, okay, once that is done with, and like a coming out story is no longer like, it doesn't have the emotional impact that it once did, then what? Because after that, it's like, oh, well, two gay people are not alike. They're going to have different values, different beliefs, and all that. And with atheism, I think the only, on that issue, what the big difference is, okay, we don't believe in God, but I may come to what I believe is a rational, thought out, critical thinking, like position on an issue, and you may come to a very different answer to how we approach the problem using the same sort of questioning, critical thinking skills. But it doesn't mean all atheists have to agree with you, even if a lot of them do. So now we're exploring those issues. And I think people make a mistake in my community when they're like, all atheists ought to think a certain way. Now, the Queer Disbelief book is saying, here's why you should. Yes, because this is good luck finding an argument against it. But the question is, where do you draw the line on that? And if we disagree on it, what am I going to do with people who say, nope, I don't think atheists should care about LGBT rights? Or this argument, I don't think gay people should be allowed to get married because I don't think the government should, sanction any marriages.
Indeed. Well, it's a similar situation with the ex-JW community. I mean, you mentioned that nearly all movements have their infighting. And I think with ex-JWs in particular, because JWs are intrinsically a high control group where everyone has to literally think the same thing. Yeah. I think that when JWs wake up and become ex-JWs, they sometimes carry that notion with them that we all need to be on the same page on things, and we all need to be singing from the same hymn sheet. And if someone expresses an opinion that differs significantly from yours on a hot button issue, he's the enemy. And that thinking, unfortunately, is way too prevalent.
And I'm sure there's a simple one of, okay, I'm no longer a Jehovah's Witness, but should I really focus on getting other people out of there? Or should I just, okay, let them be. I've made my own decision. I'm going to leave it there. Like, Lloyd, what the hell are you doing trying to convince other people to get out of there? Exactly. Mind your own damn business. I've heard that from atheists, too. It's like, okay, I don't believe in God. Why are you spending so much time trying to convince other people to be? And I can answer that question for you. But yeah, those questions are going to come up. And I don't think a lot of people in my community know how to deal with it when people who are atheists also hold values that, we don't necessarily agree with. One quick example of that, I spoke to a guy from, was it New Hampshire, I think? He is a Republican in the state government who came out as an atheist. And the question that I had for him is like, how could you possibly be an atheist and a Republican today in this party? Because that to me seems antithetical to like church-state separation and other things atheists believe in. And his answer was basically, well, I don't agree with the social stances of the party, but I'm more of a libertarian and my views on that stuff is more in line with the Republican Party. You know what happened? He eventually just left the party and became a libertarian. And there was a second Republican atheist who was kicked out because he started like a men's rights Reddit group. Like it was a scandal and he just resigned altogether. But I love those stories, because it's like, hey, look, there's a person who's totally not in lockstep with most of the atheists I know. And as a community, we're going to have to figure out, like, what do you do with that? Because you can't say, well, he's not a real atheist. The joke is like, what? Does he not believe in God a different way than you do or something? Like, he's an atheist.
No, it's important to know that these people are out there so that we know how to have the conversation, basically.
And he's not just one dude. There are a lot of atheists who think that way. There are a lot of atheists who are against abortion. There are a lot of atheists, and when I say a lot, it's not like just a couple of people. There are a lot of atheists who, man, politics-wise, I did this over the summer. I think there were 3 candidates left: Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, a couple others. And the question I just put out there on the website was, if you're an atheist who is considering voting for any of these people, I mean, I personally had reasons to say no to all of them, but tell me why. I don't want to judge you here. Just tell me what you see in these people if you're going to vote for them. And I'll just say I got a lot of responses. I don't like any of them. Like, I didn't like any of the responses, but I got a ton. Which is to say that when I just asked random people to chime in, there was no shortage of them. Who knows how many are actually out there? But it's like, wow, all these people were willing to vote for people I find so abhorrent, who are so anti everything I support as an atheist, which to me ties into atheism. And it doesn't mean anything to these people writing in. They're like, well, whatever, I'll overlook it because this other thing matters to me. They're out there. And again, right now what I'm seeing a lot of is to say, if you invite those people to speak at a conference per se, then the whole conference should be boycotted. How dare you give them a platform? If you take anything they say seriously, like you said, you're the enemy. And I don't know how long you can keep doing that until you realize, we're not a community. We're just a whole bunch of little islands. Some of us kind of in the same region, but like, there's no Pope of atheism. Richard Dawkins can't kick you out. So you're going to have to deal with this. We haven't figured out as a community how to deal with it.
Now, some of what you've talked about there touches on an issue, and it wasn't on my list of questions, but it's something that I think is quite prescient to what's going on at the moment, and that's to do with this whole issue of free speech and platforming and deplatforming and boycotting events. I'll confess I'm a little bit torn on how to deal with this, because on the one hand, I agree in the principle of the marketplace of ideas. I believe in bad ideas being listened to so that they can be dismantled. But on the other hand, I get why people would be concerned at people who have really, really obnoxious ideas, such as, feminism is wrong, and you shouldn't be gay, and transgender people are mentally ill, and really, really, horrid ideas. I get why it would be a bad idea to literally shine a spotlight on them and basically give them a free pass to spout their hatred. The only thing I can think of to kind of mitigate that situation would be if you had someone moderating what they're saying and immediately countering the hatred with logic and with reason. But I think the frustration often comes when that figure is absent. Do you understand? And they just get a free run.
The people with the offensive ideas, just room to talk and share them. Here's where I think, first of all, I think pretty much everything you said I agree with. Here's where I think it's a problem. This idea that by giving them a platform to speak, you're somehow amplifying their ideas. I promise you these people did not need you to amplify their ideas for them. They have their ways of getting their message out. Personally, I think letting them speak and just to show how stupid their ideas are, if you bring Milo to your campus or something, if some group on campus said we want to bring him in or whatever, and you show video of what he says, for the most part, I think a lot of people are going to watch that and be like, there's something wrong with this guy. What the hell? I think it does more damage to them because that's the issue. It's the stuff he says is ridiculous. So by all means, share it with everybody because I think more often than not, people are going to be turned off by it. But like you said, I understand the position. Believe me, most of the people I'm really close with in the atheist movement are on the other side of that issue, in the sense that they don't want anybody like that given the platform, certainly not at some atheist-friendly conference. Like, why are you letting them speak? I'll tell you, like, I would say to the organizers, look, first of all, if you're hosting the conference, do whatever the hell you want. But I would hope if you're inviting someone controversial, if you don't have the moderator there, like you said, which is a good idea, make sure there's a question and answer period. Don't just give them a platform to speak and then get out of there. Like, do a Q&A. Find a way to hold them accountable for what they're saying, but that should be the case for everybody. I can't remember the last time I gave a talk and wasn't at least around to answer questions about things I said. But it's also really easy for me to say that because for the most part, I'm not the guy who's affected by the things they're saying. If they say horrible things about LGBTQ people, I'm offended as someone who cares about LGBTQ people, but I'm not in that category. So it's like, it's not going to hurt my life for someone to say I'm mentally ill. You know what I mean? So again, I recognize my privilege here. It doesn't bother me, so it's easy for me to say this. And I know too many people who are genuinely hurt by this stuff. There's a difference between saying, like, I don't want to hear an opposing point of view to this person's perspective does a lot of damage. And by letting them just say it without any serious consequences, you're exacerbating the problem. I just don't know that it's always without consequence. I think you give them a chance to speak and not let them be martyrs who are like, you know, you're not allowed to speak here because the protesters wouldn't let you. I think it's too easy for them to say they were so afraid of how right I was that they didn't even want to allow me to speak. It would be so much more damning to those sorts of people to say they let me speak. They didn't boo me into silence. They didn't protest while I spoke. And then during the Q&A, every single person just made points that were better than mine. That's a better way to handle it. Or what I'd really like is if someone offensive is speaking on your campus and it was brought in through the proper channels and everything, your group should host an event immediately after that's done, countering everything that was said, and you publicize the hell out of that thing and say, you know, we don't stand for everything he said. We don't like what he said. Here's why he's wrong about all these points. That to me is way better of a way to get people not to take those people seriously. So I know why they're popular. It's because they can get away with saying, here's what people don't want you to hear. And so I'm going to be the courageous person who says it. And yes, part of me is just like, well, you're a bigot or you're a jerk. But it's so easy for them to get away with that. And they wouldn't have that power if you let them say whatever's on their mind and then came back and said, here's why you're wrong. This is what I've been trying to do with atheism for a long time, which is say, okay, here's what those apologists said about religion. Let me tell you why their argument's wrong. Here's what an op-ed said in the New York Times, written by a religious person promoting some idea. And here's why every major point they made, here's what they didn't include in the piece. That to me seems like a better way of responding than to say, you're not allowed to publish these ideas. Because I don't think people are just saying, well, it was published here, then it's going to spread. There are some examples, but like most of them are not like that.
I definitely agree with you there. There needs to be some kind of other side to the argument. That's my only concern, really, with the whole idea of platforming, that only one side of the argument is heard. And I get why people are concerned about offense being taken, especially when there's deeply offensive things being said. I'm actually more concerned as someone who's got out of a cult at the persuasive element, because, you know, when we talk about someone like Milo, we're talking about a very, very charismatic character who knows how to put on a show, and people will fall for it. And I think that's one of my frustrations when in my limited involvement in the atheist community, is that people don't understand that mind control is a thing and that people can actually be taken in by these people under the right circumstances.
Yes, that is a totally fair point to make. And I guess that means the rest of us have to up our game and to say, here's what Milo said, but you know what? Here's a charismatic person who can respond to everything he said and why it's wrong. And it's easier to do with Milo because he is so out there and he is provocative on purpose versus someone who holds the same views but is just polite and gentle and isn't getting loud about I don't watch him. I just know he's out there. But there's a guy who holds similar views who writes for like the Federalist or some other conservative publication. And when he speaks on campus, you know, he doesn't have the notoriety of someone like Milo, but he just gets up there, makes his point. It's totally an offensive point or something to me. But he's so calm about it. And then I think that angers a lot of students even more. But again, first of all, if someone's going to be influenced and persuaded by that sort of argument, they didn't have their convictions to begin with, which means you can convince them out of it. This stuff doesn't happen in like a day. No one's like brainwashed in a day, but if that person found a way to get someone to change their mind on this issue, you can do the same thing. So get your voice out there too. I realize it's hard. This is what I've been trying to do, where it's like, hey, look, there's a lot of voices on YouTube. I don't promote all of them. I promote the ones who are saying interesting things that I want people to hear. And if they start stepping into this weird area of stuff that I don't agree with, I'm just not going to promote them. And if it gets to the point where I just totally think it's wrong, then I'll push back against it. But just to say you can ignore them, it's silly because there are people who don't ignore them. So you can't just pretend they don't exist. That's what religious people do in their bubbles. You have to confront them and to say, here's why they're wrong. And you and me both know that has an impact. To say that, look, you've been taught this, you were told this, it is wrong. Here is why it's wrong. It's not wrong because they were loud about it or because whatever, I'm telling you it's wrong. Here's the reasoned argument for why they're wrong. Here's where their facts are wrong. That has staying power. Because it's not just a loud voice against a loud voice. That's why I really like Bill Maher. And I know there's a lot of atheists who hate that guy. But it's the same thing. It's like he will totally invite people who have horrible views on. They'll have a civil conversation about it for 10 minutes or something. And then the rest of us, and there are usually people on the panel who can respond to it and to fight back against it. And you don't see that in a lot of places. It's not a shouting match, you know? So I like that he kind of brings those people on and leaves it to people to say, okay, that's what they had to say. Now, world, go pick it apart if you want to. That's not a bad thing.
Yeah, it isn't. And if anything, it would be nice if there were more hosts and personalities like Bill Maher who were bringing, you know, these issues to the fore. Because I know, I
remember he invited Milo to his show, and he got one panel.
I didn't like that episode, by the way. I thought
I didn't like Bill Maher's questioning. I thought his questions were stupid, but he invited him on, and people were mad that he was giving him that platform. Right? Milo's interview, the answers he gave were so dumb that I can't. I'm like you said, I'm sure a couple of people were influenced by it, but for the most part, I think you watch that and you're like, this is the guy that's getting the attention. He doesn't know anything. What's he talking about? That is a big turnoff. And again, to say, oh, look, Bill Maher brought him on and the rest of us could watch it and rip his arguments apart and do all that. That to me is a more convincing way to tell people, don't take this guy seriously. He's not saying anything relevant, than just not allowing him. Because if Bill Maher said, well, I'm not allowing him because a lot of people don't want him to come on, he just gets more powerful, especially within the circle he already has. So it's just, again, I'm saying this from a strategic point of view, not a moral point of view.
Sure.
It's like, if you want to beat them down, let them expose their best arguments and then tear them down because we know they're wrong. It's the same thing with debates. Richard Dawkins doesn't do debates with like creationists. And there is something to that. I get it. He doesn't want to give them the platform. That's what he said. And I said the same thing when Bill Nye said, I'll debate Ken Ham at the Creation Museum. My first thought is, Bill Nye, what the hell are you doing? You're pretending this is an actual debate. It's not, right? That's the scientific argument there. But the funny thing is, in the couple of years since that happened, I have heard from so many people who said, I watched that debate as a creationist, And I realized that my side wasn't saying anything good. And it convinced me to become an atheist, or to at least accept evolution, because they heard it for the first time. It wasn't a deplatforming. It was, let's go head to head. And it convinced them.
I've actually used that debate several times in my videos, because when you're talking about Ken Ham's version of creationism, Jehovah's Witnesses would hate me for saying this, but it's not that different from their version of creationism. And you need someone, I think, like Bill Nye, spelling out in detail why it's total nonsense. And
the biggest question in that entire debate is like, what would it take to change your mind? And Bill Nye said evidence, and Ken Ham said nothing.
Yeah.
That question alone has probably done more than like anything except the God Delusion book to change people's minds, at least from anecdotally from what I've heard. I mean, that stuff makes a difference, and you wouldn't get that exchange if you just said, well, I'm refusing to debate you because you're not at my level or whatever.
Sure. Well, I'm down to my last two questions, I'm afraid,
yes.
Although I'm delighted that we could touch on that subject, because it wasn't planned, but sure. I do think it's something that people are thinking about, so now I'm thinking about it.
Definitely on YouTube.
So if you could get one message across to Jehovah's Witnesses who might have stumbled on this interview, Hemant, what would it be?
I would say to the Jehovah's Witnesses, if they're watching, you should be able to watch videos by Lloyd, by anybody else who's talking about this stuff, and be able to respond to it. I can't force you out of the faith. I can't force you to change your mind about stuff. But don't you owe it to yourself to hear the arguments coming from your critics and be able to respond to it? It's the same thing I say to religious people too, which is that, look, I'll pose these questions. I'll put them out there. I can't make you become an atheist. If you decide, I believe in God, I'm not going to waste my time telling you why God doesn't exist. But do you have responses to some of the things atheists are saying? One of the problems I have with books by like Lee Strobel, those Christian apologetics books, The Case for Christ and stuff, is that he only talks to Christians. He gives you like their straw man arguments for why God exists. And it's like he never even bothers wrestling with what atheists are actually saying. And wouldn't it be a stronger book if you could take their actual words and respond to it? So any believers watching, you should be able to respond. You should justify why it's okay for all the abuse stuff to happen. How come the two-witness rule? Like, what's the justification for that? How does that make any sense? All the things people are saying, the arguments for why these interpretations might be wrong of certain passages, if you don't have a good answer for that, or someone in the Kingdom Hall is saying you shouldn't be questioning this stuff, that should tip you off that maybe they don't have answers to it either. Same thing with Mormons. Like, if you don't have good answers, if anyone tells you take it on faith, don't ask these questions, you should just believe, they're hiding something from you. Figure out what that is. You owe it to yourself to at least believe what you believe for the right reasons.
Very well said. I echo all of those sentiments. It is important to figure it out for yourself. And like you say, if someone's saying you're not to look at this book or you're not to watch this video, then that's the book and that's the video you need to look at.
And by the way, I've Christians say, like, you should read the Bible. And the funny thing is, pretty much every atheist I know has experience with the Bible. I know atheist adults who are like, no, I tell my kid, you should read the Bible because I kind of want you to grow up to be an atheist. I don't hear in evangelical circles people saying, let's all read the God Delusion. No, more often than not, you're going to hear you should stay away from those books or those movies or that music because it might damage your mind or something like that. Whereas the smarter way, strategic way to handle that would be, go ahead, listen to it, and then we're going to talk about why that's bad for us or something like that.
Yeah, I'm losing count now of the amount of theists who say, oh, if you'd only read the Bible. It's because I've read the Bible that we're in this situation.
They did a study, like religious knowledge, factual, objective, like what do different religions believe? Who scored the Pew Research Center did this. Who scored the highest? Atheists scored the highest. Different religions scored way lower. But like when it comes to just knowing about religion, atheists do pretty well. That's why we're atheists, because we've looked at this stuff. We've talked about it. We've thought about it. and we realize it's all BS. And I can't say the same. I don't know a lot of evangelicals who could tell you a lot about the Quran, for example. They just dismiss it offhand, but they don't actually know what's in it. And isn't that a problem?
Indeed. Now, final question, which you've sort of answered already, but I want to give you a better opportunity.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to plug?
Honestly, right now, if anyone's listening, if Queer Disbelief is the book Camille wrote that I helped her with. We're Kickstartering it, and it's such a weird way for us to write a book, but I'm so optimistic. It's a good book. I've read the book. I'm optimistic about the method of trying to do this ourselves, but I'm telling you, when we're done with the final product, if we can get it out there, it's going to be worth it. So please go to Kickstarter, type in Queer Disbelief. You'll find the project. Consider pre-ordering a copy or two. So that's the only thing I'm plugging. Otherwise, you can find me at friendlyatheist.com. If you're on YouTube, search Atheist Voice.
Indeed. And again, there will be a Kickstarter link in the description. And I would thoroughly recommend checking out Hemant's YouTube channel, Atheist Voice, and his blog, because I personally think it's providing a wonderful service in keeping people up to speed on some of the more harmful elements of religion. So Hemant, thank you for keeping that website running.
My pleasure. Thank you, Lloyd. Thanks for all you do, and thank you for everyone watching for actually listening to this conversation. Not a lot of people are ever willing to hear, criticism like this, so that's good.
Yeah, indeed. So thanks for joining us, Hemant. Again, I hope I can grab you back on the channel to talk about Jainism at some point. But yeah, we'll leave it there. And I hope you've enjoyed this interview. As always, don't forget to subscribe for more interviews like this. And thank you for watching.